The snow fell heavier that night than anyone had expected. The prairie winds howled across the ranch, carrying with them a chill that could cut through bone. She had been walking for hours, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders, her boots sinking into the white drifts. Her breath came in clouds, her fingers numb, her lips turning pale with every step. The barn loomed in the distance, a shadow against the storm, and it was the only refuge she could find. She pushed the heavy doors open with all the strength she had left and stumbled inside. The air was cold but still warmer than the open sky. The scent of hay and animals filled her lungs, and she sank down in the corner, pulling her knees close, shivering uncontrollably. The barn gave her shelter, but not enough warmth to stop the frost from creeping through her body. She tried to whisper prayers, tried to convince herself morning would come and she'd survive to see it, but her voice broke and her eyes fluttered shut. That was when he found her. The cowboy had been checking on the horses, lantern in hand, his boots crunching against the straw. At first, he thought the wind had blown something inside, but when his lantern light fell upon her face, his heart jolted. She was half frozen, her skin pale, her lips trembling. Without a second thought, he knelt down and touched her shoulder. She stirred weakly, but couldn't even form words. He lifted her gently into his arms, her body limp against his chest. The snow bit at his face as he carried her across the yard, his coat pulled tighter around her. His cabin wasn't far, but each step seemed like a battle against the storm. He could feel her breath shallow against him, fading too close to silence. By the time he pushed his door open and brought her inside, his jaw was set with determination. The fire had died down to embers, but he stoked it to life, throwing on logs until the flames roared. He set her near the hearth, but even then, her skin was icy cold. He knew the old rancher's tales: when someone is that close to freezing, warmth has to come from more than a fire. Hesitation flickered in his chest, but there was no other choice. He stripped away the frozen fabric clinging to her, wrapping her in blankets, then pulled her into his bed where his body heat could reach hers. Her trembling lessened little by little as he held her close. He whispered steady words, assuring her she was safe, that he wouldn't let the cold take her. The hours crawled by as the storm raged outside, the cabin walls shaking under its force. He never once let her go, afraid that if he loosened his grip, she'd slip away from him into the silence of winter's grasp. When morning finally broke, the snow lay deep and unbroken outside, but inside the cabin, warmth had returned to her face. She stirred, her eyes opening slowly, confusion flickering until recognition came. She saw the cowboy watching her, his expression torn between relief and something deeper, something he hadn't expected to feel. She realized then that he had fought the storm not just with fire and strength, but with his own heart. The barn had nearly been her grave, but his arms had become her shelter. And as the storm gave way to sunlight over the ranch, something unspoken settled between them, something stronger than fear, stronger than the winter itself. The morning light that filtered through the cabin window was faint, softened by the thick blankets of snow that still covered the land. The storm had passed, but its remnants lay heavy on the earth, muffling every sound and leaving the world cloaked in a white silence. Inside, the fire crackled steadily, casting a golden glow that reached across the wooden walls and danced over the bed where she lay. Her breathing was steady. Now, though shallow, her chest rising and falling against the blankets that cocooned her. He had stayed awake the whole night, watching over her, listening to every small sound she made as though each one carried the weight of life itself. He studied her face in the quiet of dawn, memorizing the delicate shape of her features, the strands of hair that had fallen across her brow, the faint color that had returned to her cheeks. There was something fragile about her, but also something unyielding, as if the storm hadn't broken her spirit, just her body. He found himself wondering who she was, where she had come from, and what fate had led her to stumble across his ranch in the dead of night. Questions piled up in his mind, but he pushed them aside. For now, all that mattered was that she was alive. Hours passed before her eyes fluttered open again. At first, she seemed disoriented, her gaze shifting from the wooden beams above her to the glowing fire across the room, and finally to him. He was seated in a chair near the bed, his broad shoulders hunched forward, his head resting on the table beside him. Their eyes met, and she blinked as though uncertain whether he was real. "You're safe," he said softly, his voice low, steady, like the calm after a storm. "You nearly froze out there." Her lips parted, but no sound came at first. She swallowed, tried again, and finally managed a whisper. The barn. Her voice cracked with weakness, but he leaned forward, urging her not to strain. You found shelter, but it wasn't enough, he explained. If I hadn't checked on the horses, I don't know if I would have found you in time. His eyes darkened with the thought. The cold was already stealing you away. She closed her eyes for a moment, as though the memory of the night before pressed too heavily against her. He waited, patient, until she looked at him again. Why? She asked faintly, confusion flickering across her pale face. Why help me? He almost smiled at the simplicity of her question, though it carried more weight than she probably intended. Because no one deserves to be left to die out in a storm. Not while I have breath in me. His words were firm, unshaken. Besides, he added after a pause, something in me knew I couldn't just walk away. Her gaze lingered on him, as if trying to measure the truth in his voice. Her body still trembled slightly under the blankets, and he reached for the kettle hanging near the fire, pouring her a cup of steaming water. He held it out, and when she tried to take it, her fingers shook too much to hold steady. Without hesitation, he guided the cup to her lips, letting her sip slowly until the warmth spread through her throat. Color returned to her little by little as the day stretched on. He made her broth, coaxing her to take small spoonfuls even when she insisted she wasn't hungry. He kept the fire burning strong, adding logs until the cabin was filled with heat. He never once left her side for long, only stepping outside to check on the livestock before returning quickly, as though the thought of her being alone gnawed at him. She slept often, her body exhausted from the ordeal, but in those waking moments she began to speak more. She told him her name, though she hesitated at first, as if giving it away might reveal too much. He repeated it softly, as though testing how it felt on his tongue, and she found herself oddly comforted by the way he said it. He didn't press her for her story, though curiosity simmered in him. He could see shadows in her eyes, hints of pain she carried with her, but he knew better than to demand answers before she was ready. Instead, he offered her silence, broken only by the crackle of firewood or the quiet hum of his voice when he read aloud from an old, weathered book he kept by the hearth. She listened, not so much to the words, but to the rhythm of his tone, steady and grounding, pulling her further away from the grip of the storm that had nearly claimed her. Days passed, each one carving a deeper bond between them. He continued to care for her with a tenderness that surprised even himself. He wasn't a man given to softness. Years of ranch life had hardened him, shaped him into someone who relied on grit and strength more than gentle words. But with her, those walls seemed to falter. Every time she struggled to sit up and he steadied her, every time he caught her when her knees gave way and lifted her as though she weighed nothing, he felt something stir inside him that went beyond duty. She began to notice it too, the way his eyes softened when they met hers, the way his hands lingered just a moment longer when adjusting the blankets around her, the way his voice dropped when speaking her name as though it was a secret meant only for them. She didn't know what to make of it. She had been alone for so long, carrying her burdens in silence, and the thought of leaning on someone else both frightened and comforted her. One evening, when the snow outside finally began to melt under the sun's return, she sat by the fire, her strength slowly returning. He had given her his chair, insisting she deserved the warmth closest to the flames, while he leaned against the wall nearby. She turned to him, her expression softer than it had been since the night he found her. "You saved my life," she said quietly. He met her gaze, his jaw tightening as though her words stirred something raw inside him. "No," he replied after a moment. "You fought for it. I just didn't let the cold win." But she shook her head, her eyes glistening. "You don't understand. No one's ever fought for me like that before." Her voice trembled with the weight of truths she hadn't yet shared. I thought maybe it would be easier to let the storm take me. But you wouldn't let me go." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken meaning. He pushed away from the wall, crossing the room until he stood before her. Slowly, he reached down, taking her hand in his. His touch was rough, calloused from years of labor, yet it was steady, grounding her in a way nothing else could. "I couldn't let you go," he admitted, his voice low, almost like a confession. "Not then. Not now. Not ever." The fire crackled louder, filling the silence that followed. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she tightened her fingers around his, holding on as though she finally understood that she wasn't alone anymore. The winter storm had nearly taken her life, but it had also led her here, to his arms, his home, his heart. And as the days stretched into weeks, the memory of that night faded into something else entirely. Not the night she nearly froze, but the night he carried her back into the world of the living, and into a place she never thought she'd find again. The days following her recovery unfolded with a quiet rhythm, almost as if the cabin itself had settled into the heartbeat of something new. Outside, the snow melted in slow patches, dripping from the eaves, softening into streams that traced the land, but inside the cabin there was warmth that went beyond the firewood he stacked so faithfully. He kept her wrapped in the thickest blankets he had, though as her strength returned, she no longer needed him to guide every sip or hold her steady when she tried to stand. Still, he found himself doing it anyway, not out of necessity, but out of a pull he could not name. She began to notice the details of him as her mind cleared from the haze of exhaustion. His shoulders carried the wear of labor, broad and square, built from years of lifting, building, and taming the land. His hands bore the scars of rope burns and calluses, but when he touched her, there was surprising gentleness, as if he feared breaking something fragile. His eyes, dark and steady, seemed to hide stories he'd never spoken, and she caught herself wondering about them in the quiet hours when neither of them spoke. For her part, she had carried her own weight of silence. Nights before the storm had been filled with restless wandering, with thoughts she dared not voice. She had been running, though from what, she did not tell him yet. Perhaps it was from people who had forgotten her, perhaps from choices that had left scars deeper than the skin, or perhaps from herself. But the storm had forced her to stop running, to collapse in the straw of that barn, and he had carried her not only into his cabin but into a kind of stillness she had never known. The cabin became their world. He woke early, as always, feeding the horses, chopping wood, tending to the needs of the ranch. She would watch him from the window sometimes, the swing of his axe splitting logs in clean strokes, his breath steaming in the cold morning air. There was a rhythm to the way he moved, precise and unhurried, as though every action was guided by an inner patience. When he returned inside, brushing snow from his hat, the warmth that followed him was not just from the fire he carried in his arms but from something she had begun to feel when he crossed the threshold. They shared meals by the fire, sometimes in silence, sometimes with words that broke down barriers she hadn't realized she'd built. He never pried, but when she offered small fragments of herself, a childhood memory, a fleeting laugh at some long-forgotten joy, he listened as though it were the most important thing he'd ever heard. She told him once of the sound of bells in the village where she had grown up, how they rang on winter mornings, echoing across rooftops glazed with frost. His eyes softened at the story, though he said little. Later that night, when the wind howled again outside, he rummaged through his shelves and found an old, rusted bell from his father's things. He polished it silently, then hung it by the cabin door so she could hear its chime when the wind stirred it. It was small gestures like that which rooted themselves inside her. He wasn't a man of many words, but his actions spoke a language she began to understand. The way he placed extra wood by her chair so she wouldn't feel cold. The way he fixed a draft under the door without her even asking, the way he left half of every loaf of bread he baked at the hearth so she would never wake to an empty table. In return, she began to help where she could. At first, her hands trembled too much to hold a pot steady, but soon she found herself cooking meals with him, stirring the soups, kneading dough while he watched with a faint smile tugging at his lips. She mended a shirt of his one afternoon, the fabric worn at the elbows, and when he put it on later, the look he gave her was not one of gratitude alone but something deeper, something unspoken. One evening, when the snow was melting into the earth and the days stretched longer, he invited her to walk outside with him. She hesitated at first, the memory of that freezing night still raw, but he offered his hand, and she found her courage. The air was brisk but no longer deadly, the ground softening beneath their boots. They walked past the barn where she had nearly collapsed, and she stopped, her breath catching. He felt her hand tighten on his, and without words, he pulled her closer, guiding her past the memory as though to promise she would never have to face it alone again. It was during these walks that she began to tell him more. Not everything, some truths still lived too close to her heart to be freed, but enough for him to understand that she had known loss, that she had been abandoned, that the storm had not been the only thing trying to break her. He didn't respond with questions or judgments. Instead, he offered his silence, his presence, and that was more than she had ever received from anyone else. As the weeks turned into months, something shifted between them. It wasn't sudden, not a fire that roared to life, but a steady flame that grew each day. She caught herself leaning into his presence, listening for his footsteps outside, waiting for his voice when the evenings grew quiet. He, too, seemed to change. Where once his cabin had been a place of solitude, marked by routine and silence, it now carried laughter, conversation, and a softness he hadn't realized he missed. The bond deepened one night when a storm returned, not of snow this time, but of rain. The roof rattled under the downpour, thunder cracked across the sky, and she startled at every sound, memories of her freezing night rushing back. He noticed her trembling, the way her hands clutched the blanket, and without a word, he crossed the room, sitting beside her. She looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes, and he pulled her gently into his arms. Her head rested against his chest, and she felt the steady beat of his heart beneath the fabric of his shirt. The storm outside could rage as wildly as it pleased, but here, in his embrace, she found something she had never known before: safety. Time did not erase their scars, but it wove them together. He carried the weight of years of loneliness, of a life spent with only horses and cattle for company, of watching friends move on while he remained rooted to the land. She carried the weight of betrayals, of roads traveled alone, of nights spent wondering if life was worth fighting for. Yet, together, those burdens became lighter. He found in her someone who softened the sharp edges of his solitude, and she found in him someone who refused to let the darkness claim her. As spring replaced winter, the ranch came alive again. The ground thawed, the streams ran clear, and blossoms dotted the fields. She walked with him through it all, no longer the fragile figure who had stumbled into his barn, but a woman with strength in her step, her hand still firmly in his. The cabin, once a place of survival, had become a place of belonging. By the time spring ripened into summer, the cabin and the land around it bore little resemblance to the desolate, storm-struck world she had first stumbled into. The grass rose high and green, rolling across the ranch like a sea. Wildflowers painted the fields with bursts of color, and the air carried the scent of earth renewed. She walked among it all with him, sometimes helping with chores, sometimes simply watching, learning the rhythm of a life that was slower, steadier, more rooted than anything she had known before. She rose with him at dawn, following him to the barn where the horses waited. He showed her how to brush their coats until they gleamed, how to hold out an open palm with grain so they would trust her. At first she laughed nervously when one nuzzled her hand too eagerly, but his steady presence, the warmth of his voice guiding her through each movement. At first she laughed nervously when one nuzzled her hand too eagerly, but his steady presence, the warmth of his voice guiding her through each movement, gave her confidence. The horses seemed to sense her gentleness, leaning into her touch, and he watched her with a quiet pride he never voiced but always felt. The days unfolded in small, ordinary tasks, yet to her they carried a weight that felt extraordinary. She had known survival before, but not stability. She had known solitude, but not companionship. Even simple things, the way he handed her a tool without needing to be asked, the way she set bread on the table before he came inside, the way their paths seemed to anticipate each other, wove a bond that deepened with every passing week. There were moments, however, when the shadows of the past slipped back into her eyes. He noticed them in the way she sometimes stared off at the horizon, as if expecting someone to appear. He heard it in the tremor of her voice when she spoke of places she had left behind, names she refused to say. He didn't push her. He knew the weight of silence, knew some truths could not be forced out but only released when the heart was ready. So he gave her space, and in that space, she found herself wanting to trust him more. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the fields, she finally shared a fragment of the truth. They sat on the porch, the boards warm beneath their boots, the cicadas humming in the tall grass. She clasped her hands together, staring at the fading light. "I had no one left," she said quietly. "Not family. Not friends. I thought maybe I could outrun the emptiness, but the storm caught me before I could figure out where I was headed." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. "That night in the barn, I almost welcomed it. I was so tired. But then you carried me. You didn't know me, yet you fought harder for me than anyone ever had." He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the shadows. His silence stretched long enough that she began to wonder if she had said too much, but then he reached for her hand. His fingers, rough and calloused, curled around hers with a steadiness that anchored her. "You don't need to run anymore," he said simply. "Not from the past. Not from the storm. Not while I'm here. The words settled into her like roots sinking deep into soil. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe them. As the heat of summer grew, so did the closeness between them. They worked side by side in the fields, sweat on their brows, laughter breaking between them when tasks went awry. She teased him about his stubborn refusal to ask for help until the last moment, and he teased her about the way she wrinkled her nose when concentrating. At night, they sat on the porch under the stars, sometimes speaking, sometimes just breathing in the stillness together. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but comfortable, filled with a language beyond words. Yet, as often happens when something fragile and precious begins to bloom, the outside world eventually intruded. Strangers arrived at the ranch one afternoon, two men on horseback, their clothes too fine to belong to ranchers, their eyes sharp and restless. She saw them from the window before he did, and her body stiffened, fear flashing across her face like lightning. He noticed, stepping close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. "Do you know them?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head quickly, but he could see the truth in her eyes. Whoever they were, they carried pieces of the life she had tried to leave behind. The men dismounted, asking for directions, their tone casual but their eyes lingering too long on her. He answered them with measured calm, standing tall in the doorway, his presence enough to make them shift uncomfortably in their saddles. They left soon after, their words polite but their glances sharp. When they were gone, she sank into a chair, her hands trembling. He knelt beside her, placing a steadying hand on her arm. "You don't have to tell me now," he said, "but whatever you're running from, you don't face it alone anymore." She looked at him then, tears brimming but not falling. The strength in his voice, the certainty in his eyes, broke something loose in her chest. For years she had carried her burdens alone, convinced no one would ever shoulder them with her. But, here he was, not demanding explanations, only offering himself as a shield. That night, she lay awake long after he had fallen asleep, the fire casting shadows across the cabin walls. She listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing, felt the warmth radiating from the space where he lay, and realized that the storm had not been her end but her beginning. She had nearly frozen to death in that barn, but in his arms she had found life again, life fuller and deeper than she had ever known. Summer stretched on, each day binding them closer, each night stitching together the quiet wounds of their hearts. She began to smile more easily, to laugh without hesitation, to dream of a future not defined by loss. He, too, changed. The loneliness that had once wrapped around him like armor gave way to something softer, something brighter. Together, they carved out a world of their own, built not on grand declarations but on small, steadfast acts of care. And though neither spoke the words aloud yet, both knew what had grown between them. It was in the way his hand always sought hers without thinking, in the way her eyes softened when they rested on him, in the way the cabin no longer felt like four walls but like a home.